This video is about John Morton, a founding father you likely never heard of. He was one of 56 men who signed the Declaration of Independence. And he also served in many government positions in colonial Pennsylvania, including serving as the last Speaker of the Pennsylvania Provincial Assembly. Despite this, Morton often gets relegated to the footnotes of history because historians do not have access to his personal papers or correspondence. You see, 5 months after Morton passed away in April 1777, the British Army swept across southeastern Pennsylvania en route to capture the rebel capital of Philadelphia. Morton lived just a few miles outside of Philadelphia, and as the advancing British troops threatened the local inhabitants, Morton's widow, Anne Justice Morton, fled across the Delaware River into New Jersey, taking many of her late husband's belongings, including his personal papers and his correspondence. After the British captured Fort Billingsport in October 1777, Widow Morton reported that the British Army caused more than 365 pounds worth of damages to her late husband's property, and that damage, it's still being felt 250 years later, as John Morton, one of the most historically significant figures in pre-revolutionary Pennsylvania, remained a historical ghost, invisible to historians because of lack of primary source evidence. The following story is not told through John Morton's words. Rather, it was reconstructed through a very thin trail of documentary evidence, like newspapers, legislative minutes, county government records, and the writings of his contemporaries. This is John Morton's story. He was born in 1725 in Ridley Township, Chester County, a unique community outside Philadelphia, inhabited predominantly by Swedish and Finnish families whose ancestors first settled along the Delaware River in 1638. Tragically, Morton never had an opportunity to meet his biological father, who died several weeks before his birth. Instead, he was raised by a single mother until the age of 8 when his mother married an Englishman named John Sketchley. Now, to say this was a transformative moment in John Morton's life would really be an understatement. Suddenly, he was positioned in between two different worlds: the traditional Swedish society of his forefathers who spoke Swedish and were members of the Lutheran faith, and the English world introduced by his stepfather, with a different language, religion, politics, and customs. The Englishman Sketchley also offered his stepson valuable experiences in life that afforded him real opportunities. As a founding member of the Derby Library Company, Sketchley valued education, and he would have ensured his stepson received proper instruction in reading, writing, and arithmetic. Sketchley also worked as a land surveyor, a highly respected profession that required specialized training. He taught Morton the skill of surveying, which afforded his stepson the opportunity to enter adulthood knowing a valuable, skilled profession. Now, John Sketchley passed away in 1753, and it was around this time that Morton's career in public service first began. In 1755, Morton was elected to represent Chester County in the Pennsylvania Assembly, marking the beginning of a 19-year career in Pennsylvania's legislative body. He was elected to replace William Peters, a Quaker who recently resigned in opposition to several militia bills introduced by the Assembly in response to the outbreak of the French and Indian War. Many Quakers in the Pennsylvania Assembly, like Peters, were devout pacifists who steadfastly objected to public funds being used to conduct military operations. A wave of old guard Quaker Party members like Peters resigned and were replaced by unaffiliated individuals like Morton. It was a monumental shift in Pennsylvania's colonial politics, one that would witness growing tensions between the Assembly and the Penn family who controlled the colony. The French and Indian War exposed the enormous inefficiencies in Pennsylvania's proprietary government. Pennsylvanians and the Assembly demanded immediate action and decision-making, but the chief proprietor at the time, Thomas Penn, the son of Pennsylvania's founder William Penn, he resided in England, and unsurprisingly, transatlantic communication proved ineffective as the turmoil increased. Tensions came to a head in 1764 when an anti-Penn faction led by Benjamin Franklin directly petitioned King George III to revoke Thomas Penn's proprietary charter and make Pennsylvania a royal colony.
That the said proprietary government is weak, unable to support its own authority, and maintain the common internal peace of the province. Great riots having lately arisen therein, armed mobs marching from place to place, and committing violent outrages and insults on the government with impunity, to the great terror of your Majesty's subjects.
Morton voted in favor of the petition 6 different times, a fact not lost on the Penn family, who, although survived the political maneuver, they responded by cracking down on their political opponents, including John Morton. In November 1764, Pennsylvania Governor John Penn did not recommission John Morton to serve as Justice of the Peace in Chester County, a position he had been serving in since 1757. Justice of the Peace was one of the most important and accessible judicial positions in colonial Pennsylvania. They presided over the county's criminal and civil courts. As Justice of the Peace, Morton was on the front lines of protecting the peace, but likely as an act of political retaliation, he was denied another term in 1764. Instead, Penn commissioned loyalist William Moore, who proved himself an ally of the Penn family. And this was not the last redemptive measure Governor Penn took against Morton. In October 1766, Chester County's sheriff, Philip Ford, passed away, and it created a vacancy in an incredibly important position. Penn had to commission a new Chester County sheriff to serve out the remainder of Ford's term. Local elections concluded just a few weeks prior, but instead of appointing a candidate who recently campaigned for the position, Penn opted for Morton, and it proved to be a savvy political maneuver to rid the assembly of a skilled political opponent. Penn knew that if Morton accepted this commission, he would have to resign from the assembly because the sheriff had a lot of responsibilities that demanded a lot of traveling throughout the county. And from Morton's perspective, why wouldn't he want to be Chester County Sheriff? The prospect of serving as county sheriff presented an exciting opportunity. Few positions commanded as much respect and significance in colonial Pennsylvania. The sheriff kept the king's peace and enforced provincial law by traveling the county arresting criminals, serving court orders, selling repossessed land, overseeing elections, maintaining order in the courthouse, and a litany of other important civic duties. But what really excited Morton would have been the financial opportunity. Sheriffs received a levy for tasks they performed, and a motivated sheriff stood to earn a healthy profit. Penn's calculated move worked. Morton accepted the governor's commission, and he soon resigned from the assembly, making it a bit more friendly to the proprietary government. One of Morton's main responsibilities as the new Chester County Sheriff was carrying out court writs. Every 3 months, Chester County's criminal and civil courts tried dozens of cases. Plaintiffs, defendants, witnesses, jurors, and other invested parties required a court writ, summoning their mandatory appearance at the next court term. On average, Morton received approximately 146 writs every 3 months that needed to be personally delivered by him or one of his deputies to ensure official notice. Now keep in mind how geographically huge Chester County was. It stretched from the Delaware River to the Lancaster frontier out west, from the Maryland border to as far north as the Schuylkill River in Coventry Township. It was a massive county, and Morton would have organized the writs by geographic location and strategically planned his trips to the different regions of the county. But this was a time before mailing addresses, and little information about a person's place of residence existed besides their municipality. So where could Morton go with the best chances of locating the individuals? The center of the community. And during the 18th century, the center of the community in colonial Pennsylvania were taverns and places of worship like churches and meeting houses. He would have spent a lot of time in these places, either looking for the people of interest or chatting with the locals in hopes of acquiring their whereabouts. While visiting the local meeting house or tavern, Morton would have heard the local chatter as people talked about their lives, their vulnerabilities, their anxieties, finances, community issues, and of course, politics. But Chester County was so culturally diverse, he would have heard vastly different perspectives in Walter Hood's Tavern in East Nottingham Township, where Scots-Irish Presbyterians made up the majority of the population, from what the Welsh Quakers expressed at the sign of the General Paoli in Tredyffrin. The German Mennonite churches in Coventry Township prayed differently than the Anglicans in West Callan Township. Few places were as culturally diverse as Chester County, and few people would have understood this better than Sheriff John Morton, who experienced firsthand the day-to-day chatter that buzzed across Chester County communities during the late 1760s. And consider the broader context happening behind the scenes. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act, which imposed a direct tax on printed materials like legal documents, newspapers, and playing cards. In response, the colonies organized the 1765 Stamp Act Congress in New York City, which, interestingly, Morton attended before his tenure as sheriff began. A small sense of unity among the colonies began to stir as the sentiment of no taxation without representation began to circulate. A few years later, Parliament passed a series of new taxes and regulations against the colonies called the Townshend Duties. And just like with the Stamp Act, colonists voiced their objections. Native Pennsylvanian John Dickinson published a series of essays known as Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer, which cohesively argued against the Townshend Duties and encouraged firmer American resistance to the British overreach. Dickinson's letters were reprinted in newspapers throughout the colony, and they influenced the political conversations echoing in taverns and churches across Chester County as Sheriff John Morton engaged residents in their local communities. By the end of his 3-year tenure as sheriff in 1769, few people would have known the political and cultural makeup of Chester County better than John Morton. And it was likely Chester County's diversity that so heavily influenced his moderate political philosophy on the eve of a political revolution. Term limits prevented Morton from seeking another term as sheriff in 1769, but the residents of Chester County voted to return him to the assembly. And he also accepted various judicial positions, including a stint as Associate Justice of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, which was the highest appellate court in the colony. And interestingly, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court met directly across the hall from the assembly room in the Pennsylvania State House, where Morton remained a lawmaker in the Pennsylvania Assembly. Fast forward to 1774, and few men would have had as much experience in Pennsylvania law as John Morton. He served as a legislator in the Assembly for nearly 2 decades. He spent 3 years in law enforcement as Chester County Sheriff, and he spent nearly a decade behind the bench as a judge. He had evolved into a political powerhouse in Pennsylvania politics as the strife between America and Britain gradually crept into everyday social life. In September 1774, the Pennsylvania Assembly sent Morton and 6 others to represent the colony at a Continental Congress held at Philadelphia's Carpenter's Hall, just a few blocks away from the State House. The Congress was called by several colonies in response to the Coercive Acts. Morton and the other delegates signed the Declaration of Resolves, a collective statement by the First Continental Congress agreeing to boycott British goods until their grievances were addressed, to directly petition the king requesting an appeal of the Coercive Acts, and agreeing to meet again next spring should Parliament not address the colonists' complaints. March 1775 would be a career-defining moment for John Morton. After spending almost 2 decades in the Assembly and working on more than 245 assignments, the representative from Chester County was unanimously elected to serve as the next Speaker of the Pennsylvania Assembly. It was quite the career accomplishment for the man born 50 years earlier without a father. But he had no time to appreciate this achievement, for the workload would be demanding, especially since there was a crisis brewing beneath the surface, one that was about to engulf Pennsylvania in a bloody civil war. In April 1775, just a month after Morton assumed the speakership, the shot heard around the world sent panic up and down the 13 colonies. British troops and Massachusetts militiamen engaged in open combat at the battles of Lexington and Concord. Any hope of a peaceful resolution between Parliament and the colonies had vanquished. War had arrived. The hostilities in Massachusetts prompted a swift call for a Second Continental Congress, and Morton was once again chosen to represent Pennsylvania. He found himself in an interesting position. As the leader of the Pennsylvania Assembly, which was now meeting at a new location just upstairs in the State House because it loaned the assembly room to the Second Continental Congress, Morton listened to more moderate and conservative voices, like his former political foe, Governor John Penn, who was still urging the assembly to isolate themselves from the other colonies and communicate Pennsylvania's objections separately. Joseph Galloway, the former Speaker of the Assembly, who refused to serve in the Second Continental Congress for fear of its more radical tendencies, and John Dickinson, who, although served in both the Assembly and Congress just like Morton, he continued to express cautiously conservative opinions. Downstairs in Congress, however, the radical voices dominated. Morton's former colleague and ally, Benjamin Franklin, had resigned from the Assembly, citing his age, but he remained active in Congress, likely because his politics were more closely aligned to the revolutionary body's rebellious lean. Others, like Virginia's Thomas Jefferson and Massachusetts' Samuel Adams, advocated for an aggressive response. In June, the Congress even voted to create a Continental Army, led by General George Washington of Virginia. Morton, he was a man in the middle, which had become a familiar pattern in his life. During his childhood, he was positioned between the old Swedish society of his ancestors and the English world of his stepfather. And as sheriff, he was situated between Chester County's diversities of religions, politics, and cultures. And now, in 1775, Morton was in the middle once again, this time between the conciliatory approach of the Assembly and Congress's increasingly bellicose stance. And as the drumbeats of war grew increasingly louder, a power struggle emerged between the Assembly and Congress, the old form of government and the new, the reactionary legislature versus the radical Congress. In November 1775, the Pennsylvania Assembly passed specific instructions to its delegates in Congress, signed by Speaker John Morton. The instructions rejected any propositions that may cause or lead to a separation from the mother country or a change in government. But this tepid and moderate approach during a period of intense political strife threatened to delegitimize the Assembly, as many of its more radical members resigned to support the revolutionary movement through alternative methods. Throughout 1775 and early 1776, Speaker Morton often adjourned the Assembly early for lack of sufficient quorum to conduct business. The Assembly members who remained active often represented moderates unwilling to blindly follow the more radical demands of Congress. And by May 1776, the power struggle between the Assembly and Congress came to a head. Congress issued a statement calling for the abolition of any provincial governments not supportive of the Continental cause. This was a direct challenge to Morton's Pennsylvania Assembly. And remember, he was a member of both these institutions, meeting in the very same building. The Assembly convened 5 days later to respond to Congress's threat. But once again, it lacked enough members to conduct business, and it dissolved without a meaningful reply. That same day, a radicalized group of Philadelphians met at the State House to cheer Congress's calls to, if necessary, adopt new governments supportive of the revolution. They called themselves the Pennsylvania Provincial Committee and agreed to hold a constitutional convention to begin organizing a new government for Pennsylvania, one to replace the weak and ineffective Assembly. While Morton defended the Assembly during the intensifying political crisis, Congress remained active. In June 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced a formal resolution declaring the United Colonies free and independent states, absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown. A vote on the Lee's resolution for independence was scheduled for July 1st, and Morton spent the next several weeks stressing over his next moves. As a delegate to the Second Continental Congress, he had to personally decide whether or not he supported American independence. Voting in favor would be seen as an act of treason by British officials, and if the revolution failed, he could suffer lethal consequences. If he rejected independence and remained committed to a conciliatory approach, he and his family could be threatened by an increasingly radicalized public who already turned to vigilante justice to prosecute those opposing change. Then, as Speaker of the Pennsylvania Assembly, Morton debated whether or not to deliver new instructions to his delegates. The previous instructions specifically informed the delegates to reject calls for separation with Britain, but Congress's call to abolish uncooperative colonial legislatures and the Pennsylvania Provincial Committee gaining momentum threatened the legitimacy of the Assembly. Morton did not want to be the last speaker of the Assembly, deposed by a radical, illegitimate provincial committee, so he scraped together the few remaining assemblymen to draft new instructions, permitting the delegates to vote for independence if they chose. On July 1st, 1776, the delegates to the Second Continental Congress assembled to make the most important decision of their lives, whether or not to support Lee's resolution for American independence. Each colony would vote as a block, meaning if the majority of the delegates from a certain colony voted in favor of the resolution, the colony as a whole would support American independence. Pennsylvania had 9 delegates. They were, of course, John Morton, the current Speaker of the Pennsylvania Assembly, Andrew Allen, a prominent Philadelphia attorney, Edward Biddle, an assemblyman from Berks County, John Dickinson, an assemblyman from Philadelphia respected for his expert legal mind and writing skills, Benjamin Franklin, the former Speaker of the Pennsylvania Assembly and now one of the loudest voices supporting American independence, Charles Humphreys, a devout Quaker from Chester County, Robert Morris, a merchant from Philadelphia, Thomas Willing, a Philadelphia banker considered one of the richest men in the colonies, and James Wilson, one of the most respected legal scholars in North America. These men would decide the fate of arguably the most important colony, the colony hosting the Second Continental Congress and the colony serving as the geographic and political epicenter of the American cause. 2 members of the Pennsylvania delegation did not attend Congress's July 1st meeting. Edward Biddle, who was still recovering from an injury after falling overboard into the Schuylkill River, and Andrew Allen, a loyalist unwilling to even entertain the idea of declaring independence. Thomas Willing, Charles Humphrey, John Dickinson, and Robert Morris all voted against the Lee resolution, citing several concerns including their religious beliefs, whether or not they had the constitutional authority, the colony's military preparedness to wage a war for independence, and whether or not all alternative avenues to avoid conflict have been exhausted. Benjamin Franklin and James Wilson supported the resolution without hesitation. When it was his turn to vote, John Morton cautiously voted in favor of independence. He was not a radical ideologue like Franklin or a political theorist like James Wilson who envisioned implementing a revolutionary Republican government. Instead, Morton turned to independence as a last resort to ensure Pennsylvanians had a responsive government that could fulfill its basic duties and responsibilities. He dedicated his professional career to this idea. But since 1775, Parliament failed to address the concerns of Pennsylvanians, which subsequently threatened the future of the Pennsylvania Assembly. Morton's vote for independence was a last-ditch effort to preserve the social contract for Pennsylvanians. Despite Morton's pro-independence vote, the Pennsylvania delegation voted 4-3 against the Lee resolution. Pennsylvania was not the only colony to reject independence on July 1st. New York abstained from the vote, Delaware was evenly divided, and South Carolina also rejected the resolution. Congress wanted a unanimous decision to show Britain and other European powers the colonies were united in their cause, so Congress adjourned until the next day, when they intended to vote on the Lee resolution once again, this time hoping to secure a unanimous decision. On July 2nd, 1776, Congress introduced the Lee resolution again. A colonial delegation spent the second day deliberating on the call for independence. The New York delegation once again abstained, believing they lacked formal authorization from their colonial legislature to approve such a measure. Delaware's Caesar Rodney missed yesterday's vote, but after a dramatic 70-mile horse ride from Dover, Delaware, he arrived in Philadelphia just in time to push Delaware in favor of independence. And South Carolina, a holdout during yesterday's vote, changed its vote to now support independence. The attention turned to the Pennsylvania delegation, which was noticeably smaller than the day before. 3 delegates, Franklin, Wilson, and Morton, recommitted their support for independence, and Humphreys and Willing remained opposed. Allen and Biddle were absent from the vote once again, but this time, John Dickinson and Robert Morris also failed to show up. Their absence ensured Pennsylvania supported Lee's resolution for independence by a vote of 3-2, and not a single colonial delegation voted against the measure, ensuring the colonies unanimously declared themselves free and independent states, liberated from the British Empire. Still serving as Speaker of the Pennsylvania Assembly, Morton reconvened with the Assembly on August 26, 1776. The legislative governing body of Pennsylvania had existed since 1682, but most Pennsylvanians knew it was in its dying days as the emerging Pennsylvania Provincial Committee finalized a new constitution. Despite this, the Assembly continued to meet for the next month, even with bare-bones attendance of only 17 to 24 representatives. Speaker Morton hoped to maintain a facade of legitimacy, so he continued to open the floor for debate. Most of the remaining members voiced conservative responses to the radical actions of the Continental Congress and the Provincial Committee. On September 26, 1776, Speaker Morton signed various final accounts and certificates to pay dues owed to the assemblymen and other government officials, after which the final meeting of the Pennsylvania Provincial Assembly adjourned. 2 days later, on September 28th, members of the Pennsylvania Provincial Committee ratified a new Pennsylvania Constitution, officially establishing the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, the foundation for today's Pennsylvania government that replaced its original colonial charter. Morton did not return to the Second Continental Congress in 1777, and it was around this time he became critically sick with an unknown illness, although most historians speculate it was tuberculosis, which was quite prevalent among the Finnish community on the Delaware River. He succumbed to his illness in early April 1777 at the age of 52, becoming the first signer of the American Declaration of Independence to pass away. He was buried at St. Paul's Anglican Church's burying ground in Chester, known today as the Old Swede Cemetery, where he could finally rest in peace away from the boisterous political rhetoric that consumed the last 2 decades of his life. Now, it's not hyperbole to suggest John Morton was perhaps one of the most historically significant Pennsylvanians leading up to the Revolution. Yet, we wouldn't know that by browsing our local library or bookstore. There are few printed Morton biographies because his personal correspondence and papers have not survived, leaving historians few primary sources to meaningfully interpret his historical significance. Most of the biographies are published on genealogy web pages that recycle an outdated, sensationalized version from the 19th century. It was first introduced by Robert Waln in 1824, who apparently consulted Morton's youngest son, Andrew Morton. It's speculated that Morton lost many friends over his vote for independence, which dejected the dying man.
It was then that the patriot shone forth even amid the pangs of dissolution.
He continued with a prophetic quote Morton had apparently uttered before departing this world.
Tell them that they will live to see the hour, when they shall acknowledge it to have been the most glorious service that I ever rendered to my country.
The story was reproduced on a 4-sided obelisk erected at his gravesite in 1845, and it largely remains the dominant narrative, despite most likely being a fabricated patriotic myth, overlooking a more authentically meaningful account of his life. Fortunately, as the United States advances towards its 250th anniversary, a renewed interest in the Revolution is driving fresh research on many of the Founding Fathers, just like John Morton. There's a reason to be optimistic that these studies can shed new light on his life and career, especially as archival collections become increasingly accessible. While there won't be personal papers of John Morton published anytime soon, most of his career was documented in government records and newspapers, all of which are rapidly being digitized by local historical organizations as well as state and county governments. There's also several collaborative projects like Founders Online and the Revolutionary City that make the thousands of transcribed records from other Founding Fathers immediately searchable. This allows historians to indirectly learn about Morton through the words of men like John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, John Dickinson, and others with more readily available primary sources. While he might not have the allure of these other Founding Fathers, John Morton is a fascinating historical figure that offers a new interpretation of patriotism. He was not a chest-thumping patriot leading the charge of American independence. Rather, he represented a diverse community during a time of intense political division. He was not a partisan who shunned those who he disagreed with. Instead, he was dedicated to compromise, listening, debate, and discussion. Those were the pillars which John Morton built his 20-year career in public service. And through his life and career, we can learn more about the social and political configuration of colonial Pennsylvania, civic responsibility, the importance of community, and the complexities and contradictions of the American Revolution.